Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Vlahos, and I am the editor-in-chief of Responsible Statecraft. On behalf of the Quincy Institute, I am so excited to be moderating this panel for you today, The Epstein Files, a roadmap of post-Cold War corruption and geopolitical chaos. If you are not familiar with the Quincy Institute, which is the publisher of Responsible Statecraft, it is a think tank dedicated to re-engineering U.S. foreign policy away from endless war toward military restraint and diplomacy in the pursuit of America's interests and international peace. In a way, that is why the Epstein Files are such a fascination to many of us in this space. Revelations over the course of the last several months, based on the release of millions of documents by the Justice Department, show a man who was a node in so many geopolitical events, schemes, and enterprises, leaving people and places open to instability, violence, and human degradation, all ingredients for world conflict, whether he knew or not, or cared or not. As one of our panelists today, Murtaza Hussain, has said, the powerful people who shared Epstein's network spent a tremendous amount of time engaged in sordid and self-interested financial dealings, manipulated public institutions to their personal ends, and profiteered from the most extreme human misery, all to say nothing of their evident involvement in the global sex trade and, in some cases, pedophilia. So, we get it. Epstein's role and the kind of Washington policies that have driven such conditions are not difficult to identify. Consider for a moment Epstein's role in the Contra affair, playing an interlocutor in the illicit sales of arms shipments through Israel by the CIA to Iran, for which payment was used to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, who are also pumping cocaine onto the streets of America in the 1980s. That was just the beginning. Epstein's role in brokering the friendship between the UAE and Israel, his work with international intelligence agencies, including Israel, moving money and illicit goods, including allegedly human trafficking, involved people at the highest levels of government, the Ivy League, finance, tech, and business. They have all been deemed the Epstein Class, and their ambitions were never for the greater good, but for personal gain, which means more than not feeding on conflict and fragility, never endeavoring to stop it. This seems like even too much to put our arms around, which serves the naysayers. They say Epstein was a con man, a very smart one, but there is no global conspiracy, just a guy with a lot of important friends and a lot of money and influence, and yes, debauched sexual proclivities. We are here today not so much to plumb a single conspiracy, but to look at whether or not Epstein was a critical figure in a modern elite class that, driven by avarice and an amoral, if not immoral, approach to the highly networked world stage, have hastened the erosion of the global order as we know it and are making the world a less safe and in many ways less livable place for the 99%. So let me introduce our panelists today so we can get into what promises to be a very intense and important conversation. Murtaza Hussain is an investigative journalist and reporter at Dropsite News, specializing in national security, foreign policy, and human rights. Formerly with The Intercept, he focuses on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and South Asia, including coverage of the surveillance state and state violence. He has reported from Egypt, Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Pakistan, and other countries, and covered top secret national security leaks from Pakistan, Iran, India, as well as the FBI and NSA. Ana Kasparian is an American independent political commentator, media host, and journalist. She is a host and producer of the online news show The Young Turks, has formerly hosted The Point on the TYT network, and co-hosted a Jacobin YouTube show, Weekends with Ana Kasparian and Nando Vila. And last but not least, Harrison Berger is a correspondent at the American Conservative magazine. He has contributed to Dropsite News, The Nation, and Responsible Statecraft, focusing on civil liberties and U.S. foreign policy. Previously, he was a researcher and producer for System Update with Glenn Greenwald. So thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate you affording me the time and Quincy the time today. So all three of you have made enormous contributions to this story, long before and during the most recent release of the Epstein files to the public. One of the biggest frustrations, I think, among journalists is explaining, how or why they should care about this story. The public is awash with a fire hose of emails, documents, tawdry details that are nonetheless grasping to sort of build into a narrative. And it's hard for the public to get a sense of what the bigger picture is. So I wanted to ask you, each of you first, what does the Jeffrey Epstein, why does the Jeffrey Epstein story matter? And Murtaza, I think since you wrote the aforementioned column for Drop Site about why it matters, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Kelly, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'm honored to be here with Anna and Harry as well, too, both whose work I really admire, and also Quincy. And thank you everyone for joining as well. And I thank a lot because it's almost a battle to get people to pay attention to the story, the actual crux of the story. There's been a tremendous amount of coverage of Epstein over the past several years, but the nature of the coverage in most of the establishment media, I would say, it has the characteristics of what was referred to in the past as a limited hangout. And limited hangout for the term of art means basically, essentially, there's a story that's very important that the public has come to know about to some degree, and only revealing a portion of that story or covering a portion of it very intensely, and leaving the other more salient and more damning parts of it out of the public eye, and then hoping that people are sated and move on. I think that's happening very much with this Epstein affair at the moment. So, predominantly, we came to know of Jeffrey Epstein, most people, as in the context of the sex crimes, which took place, it came to public light a decade and a half before his death, and then finally he passed away in 2019 under, in Manhattan prison under unclear circumstances. But, there's a much broader story to who Epstein was and what he's significant of. And I think that it's a story of the world after the end of the Cold War. Because Epstein, if you look through his emails, and I think it's become almost undeniable at this point with the latest tranche of emails, he was not just a rich individual, as people have depicted him, who had, malign sexual proclivities and things like that. He was a very influential and powerful political actor. This was a person who was arranging meetings with heads of state. He was helping do backchannel diplomacy over the course of major wars. He was somebody who intelligence agencies, senior intelligence officials called upon. He was brokering gas deals and port deals all over the world. This was a person who was extremely powerful, influential, but outside of his sex crimes, most people didn't even know who he was. They didn't know he didn't work for an organization. He didn't have a business card. He didn't have any of those formal signifiers that we tend to think of connote an individual with power. And I think that's reflective of the way the world has changed in the last 3, 4 decades. Because during the 20th century, it was very common that someone who was powerful, influential, was a government official or an official of an organization one could recognize and so forth. I think what's happened in this post-Cold War world where institutions have been deliberately weakened and power has moved into private networks of very wealthy individuals who, in many cases, are more powerful and more influential in the states. And you can see in these emails, Epstein and people who he was talking to, who are like him in this sort of network world, they were making decisions which impact the lives of millions and tens of millions of people in some cases. They were making decisions that one would expect a diplomat to make, someone you could hold to public account or FOIA their emails or have some transparency over. They were doing all this in private. So I think that the reason that they have a hard time covering the story is, a number of reasons. First of all, the connections to intelligence agencies, American intelligence, Israeli intelligence. These are things that it's very uncomfortable to cover for establishment media organizations for various reasons. But secondly, I think that it's the same way that, a fish is very difficult to describe the water around them. All these institutions are now sort of embedded in the same sort of de facto corrupt ethos of this private networks of power, and the whole thing makes them uncomfortable. So, if you have Epstein and he's in the world of several thousand people around the world who know each other, who are working together, who are very rich, who have political influence, and then you're asking them to describe that world and describe it in a way which is honest, which would obviously be troubling or infuriating to many people who realize how much this cuts against the ostensible democratic system they live in. it'll make them very hard mad. It'll be very hard for them to report on that. So I think that's why it's become a story which we have to sort of force the issue a little bit and force attention to what people are seeing in these emails. And I'll say one final thing. There was this dump of emails. The drop side reporting that we've done, the predominant amount of it has been not based on those emails, and based on emails which were released without consent in a way. They were hacked from Ehud Barak and a few other people, and that they revealed, these communications with Epstein. The government disclosures have been heavily redacted, and not only that, they've been released in a way which is deliberately making it as hard as possible for the public to understand what's in them, because they're not millions of documents, no explanation, not chronological, just dumped on the internet. That's almost as good as trying to hush it up in a way. It basically is trying to contribute to the cover up, spreading confusion, spreading kind of chaotic information environment. So what we're trying to do is sort through this and reconstruct the picture of this networked world of which Jeffrey Epstein was an important node, but which still exists and which has continued to grow even more in the 7 years since he died.
Thank you, Murtaza. That was excellent. Anna, your thoughts on why should we care about this story?
Okay, I would argue that we should care about this story because it goes much deeper than the sexual abuse of minors, which is bad enough. But essentially what I have learned, or at least my perception from the reading of the Epstein files and the incredible reporting that Dropsite has been doing on the files and the leaked emails, is that we are existing under what feels like somewhat of a shadow government. It's felt more and more to me that our political system here in the United States is really just a facade, and that there's something transpiring that we have no say on, behind the scenes. And so once I started realizing, our whole democratic process and this whole facade of having a say over how your country is governed is total BS, I realized how important it was to talk about this story as often as possible, as loudly as possible, because these secret backroom deals are bad enough when you hear about elected lawmakers engaging in it. But in this case with Epstein, we're talking about Epstein, billionaire bankers, foreign leaders, people who should have no say over the governance of our country, not only having a say over the governance of our country, but having a say over foreign policy, the outcomes of wars. Syria comes to mind, and how Epstein was trying to forge some sort of relationship between Ehud Barak and with Putin in regard to the Syrian Civil War, which we all know was really just a proxy war with all sorts of actors involved. But to me, it's important for people to understand that if you have this shadow government operating behind the scenes and they're tremendously wealthy, they've got the resources to get what they want. I mean, the Iran-Contra story blew my mind. I couldn't believe that Epstein was involved even in the Iran-Contra story. All of this stuff to me is much more critical for people to know about, as opposed to just minimizing the Epstein story to nothing more than a disgusting pedophile that preyed on young girls. That is bad. I'm not minimizing that. But the Epstein story has ramifications that stretch far wider than that.
Yeah, it's both very depressing, but in a somewhat hopeful way, like getting all of this information rather, just strips the veil, or maybe we say rip a Band-Aid because it really hurts, but like we need it to heal. And I feel like just being under, like you said, a shadow government without realizing the extent of it, it lulls us into some sort of state in which we feel helpless. But having that information might get us somewhere where we can get out of that shadow at some point.
Hopefully, but
hopefully
for me personally, it shed light into the reasons for why our government, we see continuity in what our government carries out in regard to foreign policy, regardless of who gets elected. And I'm having a better understanding of why that continuity exists. And, there's a lot of talk about the deep state, and the deep state probably means different things to different people. But for me, what was transpiring with Epstein and what probably continues to transpire even after Epstein is gone is what the deep state is. These are the power players behind the scenes who actually make the decisions about what happens in our country and abroad.
Thank you. Harry, what are your thoughts on why Jeffrey Epstein matters? I think you might still be on mute.
Sorry about that. I was
okay.
just saying, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. You know, I'm a big fan of the Quincy Institute and Maz and Anna. And so it's very exciting to,
Thank
to
you.
be on
Right
the
back
panel
at
with
you.
But I agree with everything that Anna just said, which is that it does expose this shadow government or deep state. And it reveals it not because Epstein was necessarily personally involved in every deep political event, but because, as I heard someone say on X the other day, he's kind of like this deep state Forrest Gump who just kind of pops up randomly over the course of 30 years with the most powerful business and government elites in ways that reveal who actually makes the political decisions in the United States and around the world. So with Iran-Contra, for the example, but also with Epstein and Les Wexner's role repurposing the CIA airline used in Iran-Contra, Southern Air Transport, for who knows what purposes. So you can really see this common theme from the emails, which is that these global decisions are made not by the democratically elected governments that we have, but by factions within the deep state who may compete with each other, though mostly cooperate with one another for mutual benefit. I'll add on, though, that it also exposes these parts of the deep state that maintain U.S. support for the foreign government of Israel, which was one of Epstein and Wexner's primary roles, exerting pressure both publicly and privately to ensure that our unconditional support for Israel just continues no matter what. That was the role of the mega group that they co-founded in the 1990s with Zionist oligarchs like Michael Steinhardt to fund Birthright, but also to lobby on behalf of Israel at a time when Israel's settlement expansion enterprise had really threatened the relationship, the unconditional support that the United States has given Israel since the death of JFK. And so that was really a pivotal role of Epstein and Wexner that I think comes away from these documents, and I think should be emphasized.
Absolutely, and we'll talk more about Israel as we move into the hour. We have less than an hour, and I know that, I mean, this topic is like too huge to even tackle, so I'm going to try to keep it narrowly focused on the foreign policy and the geopolitical aspect. But I also want to remind the audience, if you do have a question, we'll try to get to some of your questions. Just put them in the Q&A. Murtaz, I want to go to you. I think it was, I don't remember if it was you or Anna who brought up the Iran-Contra affair, but like, I think most people, on this call are probably a little too young to remember Iran-Contra. But I mean, simply put, the CIA was trying to find a workaround so that it could secretly sell weapons to Iran in order to create a slush fund for their proxy war in Nicaragua. Unbelievably, Jeffrey Epstein and his then roommate Stanley Pottinger, as mentioned, have been identified as playing roles. You've written about this with Harry. Can you walk us through this and maybe kind of extrapolate, like, was this the very beginning of Jeffrey Epstein's role in sort of influencing our foreign policy and geopolitical affairs?
Yeah, so Jeffrey Epstein would have been a relatively young man at the time of Iran-Contra. And you talked about it a little bit, Kelly, but I think for the people who are not familiar with the Iran-Contra scandal, people tend to think of it as as you described it, like, there were money raised for funding a war in the Nicaragua and then arms were sold to Iran. And that is true. But I think that one of the most important things about Iran-Contra and understanding literally the world has developed in the last couple of decades is this creation of these black budgets. because the money that was raised for Iran-Contra, it was a very lucrative business. The selling of arms to Iran, in this case, was done at several times markup, sometimes 10 times markup for weapons. They're making tremendous profits. And the reason for those profits were to fund these operations around the world that they didn't want the public to know about. They didn't want to show up in any budgetary requests. They didn't want someone to be able to FOIA it. Something completely deniable and off the books. And that became like a template for how to operate in this world. So you could conduct terrorist attacks, you can conduct insurgencies, and they were doing these things with this money. And Jeffrey Epstein, the reason his name sort of makes sense to come up in this context, and we did a story about it at Dropsec going through the whole history. I won't go through all of it, but he was described, and he has been described as someone who was very good at money laundering. And also, the New York Times also has characterization of him as a con man, a criminal. It's not untrue in a way. It's just that in this case, money laundering is a very, very useful tool to intelligence agencies. Because if you want to do, acts around the world, if you want to conduct an insurgency, if you want to fund a terrorist attack or whatever else it is, you can't go to the public and say, please give me a budgetary disbursement for $5 million to do this because it's illegal, or you people wouldn't like it, or what have you. If you can find a way of making money, hiding money, and keeping a off-the-record budget to do those kind of things, which are illegal or moral or whatever, then having people who are good at hiding money and money laundering is not just important, it's crucial to the entire enterprise. So his finance background and his talent at doing that, which is by now is quite well established, is natural to make sense in the context of Iran-Contra. And he had close ties with individuals who were part of Iran-Contra, like Adnan Khashoggi and Pottinger and others as well too. But one thing that I think me and Harry reported on this is that after the planes were discovered, which were moving the guns and drugs between Nicaragua and Iran, and through Israel as well too, it really should be called Israel-Iran-Contra. That was a more accurate name for the actual event. Epstein himself took possession of those planes and repurposed them for use for Leslie Wexner's retail empire. So the same planes that were carrying the guns and the drugs and so forth were then carrying clothes for Victoria's Secret and Abercrombie and Fitch and so forth. And Epstein, of course, was at the core of that, given his relationship with Wexner and later his power of attorney over the Wexner fortune. So it's really a very important episode to understand the world in which Jeffrey Epstein was not just involved in, but helped shape this world of off-the-books money, covert operations outside of public attention. And people often, they describe these events, which are not fully, disclosed or acknowledged by the government, as somehow being conspiratorial. But the fact is, the entire activities of this class of people, the rich people who were political actors, working with each other, cooperating, or sometimes at cross purposes, by nature, the fact that the media doesn't report it and it's not reported by the government acknowledged, it is by nature a conspiracy. It's a conspiratorial event between elites. And Iran-Contra was the first major, episode that we became aware of, and it's only continued since then. We don't even know what happened to that money and how much money may exist off the books today by Epstein and people like Epstein.
Can I ask a question, if you don't mind?
Absolutely.
One of the things that I'm trying to get a firmer grasp on is, there's no question that Epstein himself was a huge supporter of Israel. He was a Zionist. There's no question. And he did carry out work on behalf of Mossad. I don't think he was a Mossad agent by any means. I think he was used as an asset, or at least carried out some work for them. But I kind of want to have a better understanding about, his relationship to Israel, right? So was it just simply that he had this very close buddy-buddy relationship with Ehud Barak, and because of that relationship was requested to do some work on behalf of Mossad? I know that he was trying to forge deals with other foreign leaders, or forge deals on behalf of Israel with other foreign leaders, whether it was procuring cyber weapons and things like that. I guess the question that I have, and I'm having a difficult time understanding what's going on here, is when you look at someone like Leslie Wexner, you have a journalist like Whitney Webb saying he's never going to get prosecuted for anything. He's above Jeffrey Epstein. And so when you hear statements like that, like, what do you two make of it? I'm curious what you think, right? Because I'm trying to figure out if Jeffrey Epstein is this powerful person at the top who keeps getting contracted to do things on behalf of powerful intel organizations or world leaders, or was he just a cog in a much bigger machine? And what is that machine?
That was actually one of my questions, so I'm very excited to hear the answer. So Murtaza and Harry, I want you both to take a stab at that one for sure.
Well, why don't you go ahead, Harry? I'll ask it.
Well, I was first gonna piggyback off something which you were saying about Epstein's role in Iran-Contra, which I think may answer this question, which is that everything that you just said, this theory that Epstein's central role was as this money launderer, which I believe too. There's a lot of evidence to support that, especially the sorts of people that he was around in the early 1980s and his role at Bear Stearns, the allegations that were made about that. Um, I think that when it comes to someone like Leslie Wexner, the relationship and who was in charge is unclear. But we know, and we could see from the files now, that there were transfers that were marked, I think, by the Department of Justice. There was some file where there was unusual activity or suspicious activity, and the DEA was involved somehow. So it's unclear who was in charge, but it was obvious that they were working together since the early 1990s, including the fact that we know that in 1991, Les Wexner gave Epstein power of attorney. Obviously, when Les Wexner went into his deposition last week, he made these claims about Epstein stealing from him and Epstein being taken advantage of by Epstein, but there isn't really a lot of evidence to support that, and it seems like a claim that he's making in retrospect to kind of conceal what was actually going on there. And so again, as I said before we started the webinar, it does seem like kind of a black box that we're dealing with, where we know the networks involved and we know the figures involved, but we don't know who is in charge of who. Maybe Murtaza has a better answer.
Well, it's funny when you look at the emails between Ehud Barak and Epstein, and we spent so much time reading these emails at this point. One thing is very clear in the emails is that there's a clear power dynamic in their interactions. And you would think that Ehud Barak, this time 2013, 2012, he was still defense minister. He was still near the peak of his political power in Israel. He was a former prime minister. He was one of the most, influential people in the world, you could say, just that strata of world leaders and so forth. So you would think that Epstein was be seeking his attention and trying, the power dynamic would favor Barak. It was really quite obviously the opposite. It was really Barak who was seeking Epstein's attention very eagerly, trying to be his friend, trying to work with him, trying to meet up with him as much as possible. There was a clear sort of dynamic there that comes across from reading their correspondence. And to the question of who we work for and what's the nature and connotations of this network, I think that Harry's right. It is a bit of a black box, and everything we have is very fragmentary, and we'd be able to put together quite a bit of it. But really, it's just only a portion of whatever this network is and how it operates. We don't really know who answers to who and if there's an organization or not, or what it looks like. But one thing I'll say is that, in the context of the Israel thing, it's interesting. So I don't think that Epstein worked for any government agency. I don't think he worked for the Mossad or anything like that. This is my personal view. But I do think that you don't really need to do that in this case. There's actually a very interesting book that was written several decades ago by a gentleman named Victor Ostrovsky. And Victor Ostrovsky was a former Mossad agent, and he left the agency and he wrote a book about his time there and so forth. And the book is very interesting because he actually describes the methods of operations of the Mossad globally. And what he said is that unlike, at the time, the KGB or the CIA and so forth, which had thousands and thousands of agents, the Mossad only had a very small handful of case officers. They didn't have very many because the way they operated was that they relied on this vast network of people who would help them and who were not formally affiliated would help them. They were called Sayanim, I think the Hebrew term that they used to describe this. So the Sayanim would be like, mostly with low-level people. They'd give you like a fake bank account or a car or an apartment if you're in a foreign city or some sort of assistance like that. But there could be rich signing. There could be billionaires who are signing. There could be all these people who are not affiliated with the organization. They're not agents by any means, but they're known, they're identified, you're in touch with them, and they are ideologically committed and they will help you. That was kind of the role that these people would play. So when I see Epstein, he kind of fits more into that category. It's not that anyone had to recruit him or he had a badge and a gun or whatever. or that he would report to the head of the Mossad or be answerable to them, or even answerable to the Israeli public for that matter. I don't think he's answerable to any of them. But he was a person who they know they could rely on. They just kind of instinctively knew he would act on behalf of the interests of Israel, and he would advocate for them and so forth in certain channels. So I think that that's kind of more how I imagine him and the role he played. It was sort of an informal but ideologically committed role that he was very well placed and influential to play.
Before we move on, I wanted to ask about the drop site reporting about the surveillance equipment and other security procedures that were instituted at Jeffrey Epstein's apartment. I mean, what does that say to you? Is it just because Ehud Barak was a former prime minister and they afforded those kind of security provisions for pro forma, or was there something else going on?
Yeah, so we did the story recently based on the DOJ disclosures. The emails were in there. Basically, that the Israeli government or the Israeli consulate and mission in New York had actually installed a security system at Epstein's apartment on 66th Street in Manhattan, the apartment building. That building was very notorious for being used for sex trafficking and keeping young women and stuff like that. But Barak had been staying there for numerous times, for long stretches of times. Israeli intelligence agents had stayed there. His chief of staff of Barak at one point, Yoni Korn, also stayed for a very, very long time in that apartment as well. So, as you know, like in Israel and the US, other places, heads of state are often entitled to security after they leave office. So it seems like in this case, he was staying at Epstein's apartment for these stretches of time. The stretches were long enough that they decided to install permanent security, actually install equipment and so forth, drill holes in the wall, entry and access procedures for the building itself that were run and correspond directly with the consulates in New York, the Israeli consulate. So the Israeli consulate officials had to interface with Epstein's staff. They knew who they're talking to. They knew they're dealing with Jeffrey Epstein's staff. They knew they're dealing with Epstein, who was personally approving these installation measures. So I would say that at the least, it showed that they were indifferent to his notoriety. Like by this time, he was a very famous, probably the most famous sex offender or pedophile in the world. It's just that they didn't care. And that's at least they didn't care. And that's a very common theme in his interactions. People didn't really care about what he was doing. That thing is kind of treated like a joke or making light of it and stuff like that. So, people have suggested to me that they're putting CCTV cameras up in the apartment and filming and blackmailing people. I don't think that the emails that we reported show that per se. That could be what was going on. There's been other reporting and documentation about that subject. But it does show that the relationship between Barak and Epstein was very, very deep and intimate and long-lasting. Barak has claimed that he barely even knew Epstein. That's clearly just not true. He was living in this apartment building, this very notorious apartment building, for long enough that the Israeli government was actually getting involved and having direct contact with Epstein's staff. So I think it shows that. And, I think and again, this is not something they released, something that they made easy to find or disclosed in a very honest way. It's something we just happen to find fragments of in these emails. So I think it does warrant more scrutiny of not just that apartment, but his townhouse in Manhattan, where it said that even more egregious abuses were taking place, and there's known to have been like a video monitoring station in there. So I think that we're still at the beginning of digging through this.
I have to say, the more we learn about the Epstein files, the more questions I have. So, for instance, one of the emails that stood out to me was an email sent to Ghislaine Maxwell in the aftermath of 9/11. And she was asked whether she was willing to be part of some sort of shadow 9/11 commission. Other emails, she's like fantasizing about a world where not a single Arab exists. I also remember prior to 9/11, I think the day before, the Bush administration had disclosed that the Pentagon lost, like, I don't remember the exact figure, but it was in the trillions of dollars. Then 9/11 happens. When we talk about these shadow budgets or, money that's raised in nefarious ways for nefarious purposes, it might be wrong to connect those dots, right? But I definitely have a little bit of suspicion in regard to why was that money missing? What was it used for? Where did it go to? Why would anyone in the government reach out to Ghislaine Maxwell, of all people, to ask her to be part of a shadow 9/11 commission? And look, these are questions that are considered unacceptable and very naughty. Oh, you're getting into conspiracy territory. But I think it's safe to say that, with what we've already seen with the Epstein files, you're probably on the right track if you're susceptible to conspiratorial thinking. Okay, because a lot of these things ended up being conspiracies. I mean, the Iran-Contra story is just one example of that. And I'm very curious, what you think about that, Murtaza, like what you think about the missing money and the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell was asked to be part of that 9/11 commission.
I hadn't seen that email. I should go look at that. But just your broader point, I think that if you were to describe the entire Epstein episode to somebody 10 years ago, and just describe this is what's happening, a network of very rich people are engaging in sex trafficking and manipulating global politics and so forth, which is now documented in these emails, it would be considered absolutely outrageous. It would be considered just difficult to see, sort of social offshore, even rich thing, all happen to be true in a very visceral way, which I think a full concept yet. We have only a very preliminary understanding of even today. So I think that it should embolden us to ask difficult questions and to not be cowed and afraid by these mechanisms of social control and political control. When certain ideas are deemed almost, irresponsible or unthinkable even to ask, I think we should be asking all these things. And and again, I would say this is a huge failing of the media, the establishment media, because our reporting and a few other people's reporting now has shown conclusively that Jeffrey Epstein was a political actor. Intelligence agencies are connected to him. He was very influential in all these ways. If you were to go by the establishment media, and I'll pick on the New York Times, their reporting of this, it's just completely limited to the fact he's a scam artist and he was a pervert. That was basically the whole story. There's nothing beyond that. Raising anything else is completely crazy. So that's in and of itself shows the shortcomings of the attempts of narrative control and damage control that they're doing around the Epstein story. So I think we should all be emboldened to look through these files and ask difficult questions. And I don't think any question per se off limits at this point. I think everyone should research and search through it rigorously, but without fear of what they may find, because there's a tremendous amount in here, and the institutions that should be covering it are just not doing that.
Absolutely. And again, I feel very lucky to have you three on this program because you guys are asking those questions and doing the deep dives and all of the original reporting. So thank you. Harry, I want to go to you. Let's carry on this deep state theme here. Dropsite has done, and you have done some amazing reporting on the connections with Epstein and Dubai's DP World chairman, now resigned chairman Sultan bin Sulayem. Not only did these two men have an intimate personal relationship, the Sultan shows up in like more than 1,000 times in the email. They had an intense business relationship as well. And, this partnership of sorts is actually being credited with seeding the UAE normalization and the Abraham Accords. Before we go into that, can you talk a little bit about Dubai and the fact that DP World, which has ports in like 80 countries and has been a haven for illicit off the books laundering, shipping, including blood diamonds, high stakes money laundering. How has this relationship played into unaccountable foreign influence in our foreign policy and the greater theme of the unaccountable Epstein class hastening, the decay of like the world order?
It's an interesting question. When you think of Dubai and I would say like organized crime that is famous there, the thing that it reminds me of really is BCCI, which is the bank that I guess Epstein is reportedly involved in. Adnan Khashoggi was absolutely involved in that bank. It was also a CIA bank. It was set up with the help of the CIA. And it was also set up by Zionists. And that kind of power network of Zionist organized crime, the CIA, that has been around since the founding of the intelligence community in the United States, with people like James Angleton, who were committed Zionists buried in Israel, reportedly helped to give nuclear weapons to the Israelis against the wishes of our own president. And so I think that, as you can see with an event like Iran-Contra, And as we also saw this past year with the JFK assassination disclosures, Israel is involved in a lot of these off-the-books activities that our CIA engages in. So, for instance, the one I just mentioned with the JFK assassinations, it was revealed that James Angleton, the counterintelligence chief of the CIA in the 1960s, was using a Mossad cutout to run his Murder Inc. operations in Cuba. And this had been redacted for like 60 years now at this point. Just showing the lengths that our government will go to redact Israel out of our history. But these networks between Zionists and our own intelligence community have been around for a long time. And of course, they've been engaged in all sorts of crimes, mainly arms dealing to the countries where we're engaged in covert operations. And so Dubai seems like a hub for that sort of activity today, and very similar to BCCI.
Murtaza, do you have anything to add? Because I know you guys did a lot of reporting on this.
Yeah, no, I agree with Harry, and I would go even further because if you look at the origins and the growth of Dubai, it's sort of like a unbelievably rapid development, and the immense amounts of capital which are now concentrated in Dubai and the UAE more generally. It's very fascinating. I think it's never really a story which has been adequately told or explained, but it does have a very close relationship. Looking at the documentation, including the life of Epstein himself as well, there is a tremendous nexus between intelligence agencies, organized crime, the drug trade, the global sex trafficking trade. They're all sort of coalesced in this one country, which within our lifetimes and within living memory was basically completely undeveloped, had nothing there. It was like a pearl fishing sort of zone. Now it's become like a global elite hub. And I think that it was created purposely for this kind of purpose. It was created as sort of a place that these illegal dealings could take place without people could have sovereign immunity from crimes. It's sort of like a base for transnational, international crime. That's kind of what it is, in fact. And Dubai and the UAE more broadly has evolved into that. And there was a close nexus between, the need for having something like this in the Middle East, another base for Israelis, a place for criminals from other countries around the world, and then people from the West as well too, to store capital, to evade law enforcement, to do all sorts of things. Dubai and the UAE has been essential to that. So I think that you can't really understand the American activities in the Middle East over the last couple of decades without understanding the role of the UAE, which is not a normal country, you could say. It's a country which is very much created as sort of a project. And our story talking about Epstein's relationship with Sultan Salam, the former head of DP World, who's actually left the role a few weeks ago after our reporting and a few others. That's a very essential story because that actually explains how this sort of nexus between the institutions of the UAE, the institutions of Dubai, and this transnational network sort of melded together because through the auspices of this company, DP World, they have control over port facilities and logistic infrastructure in many parts of the world, across Africa, parts of Europe, Middle East, North America, South America. There's this sort of web. And I think that one thing about Epstein, which was very intelligent actually, that he knew very well, was that he knew where power came from in a very intimate way. And that's why he was very involved in trying to be at the cutting edge of technological developments. He was very interested in aware of finance. But also he knew about logistics, and he knew that from maybe his time in New York and beyond that if you control the ports in a certain area, that control of ports gives you tremendous influence and economic power and political power over that area. If people have watched the television show The Wire, they know that the ports were a very important part of organized crime in that show. And I think that what he did is take that sort of idea global. And this relationship he had with Salam, the head of Dubai Ports World, sort of allowed the globalization of this mafia-like influence over port facilities all over the world. And I can keep going on and on about this because there was also an Israeli connection. The Israeli surveillance technologies embedded in these Dubai Ports World facilities thanks to Epstein's sort of integration with Salam and the Israelis. But that's sort of what's happened. So I think that it's a very troubling. I think that the operations and existence of a country like the UAE in its current configuration should be very troubling to people all over the world who are not part of the elite because it's become a base for this sort of elite, effectively criminal organizing. And that's what's happening and we can see in these communications and these stories.
Well, let's talk about the foreign policy a little bit. Anna, I mean, running alongside of all the business transactions is the suggestion that Epstein and Suleim had, negotiated a lot of not just business deals, but they were nearing more political détente with Israel. And by the time that Jeffrey Epstein was killed, died, committed suicide, there was these Abraham Accords that were sort of like, they were formulating. Trump comes in, he announced this great normalization between the UAE in Israel. But a lot of this stuff had been in the works because of Epstein and Suleim. But when you look at the repercussions or the implications of these accords, they are solidifying power, the gravitational power between the UAE and Israel at the expense of the Palestinians, also isolating Iran. The UAE becomes more powerful and less accountable. We know that they have been funding violence in Yemen, as well as Sudan and Libya. And lo and behold, nobody talks about it. They are sort of untouchable. Can you talk about the foreign policy, the geopolitical implications of that very intense relationship and what was formulated out of it on the world stage?
I mean, to some extent, the Abraham Accords solidified certain alliances that already existed, but were kind of secretive in a way, right? So, like Saudi Arabia and Israel already had some pretty serious diplomatic relations. Sure, you would hear from the Saudi royals; they would, wag their finger every now and again when Palestinians were being slaughtered in mass by Israel. But aside from that, there was really no effort to rein in Israel's behavior at all. And it was because they, by and large, behind the scenes, already had diplomatic relations and, potentially some shared economic relations too. But my biggest issue here is that the whole point of the Abraham Accords is to normalize a nefarious genocidal state and, more importantly, the project that they are pursuing right now as we speak. I don't know if these Arab countries who have been a little more amenable to Israel realized that Israel is pursuing the Greater Israel Project, but that is what they're doing. And weakening, destabilizing various countries like Libya, like Syria, it's all part of that game. And so I think the reaction from Hamas was partly due to the Abraham Accords, because that was essentially sealing the fate of the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah, and we could have done the whole show on just those elements alone, the UAE, Israel, Epstein nexus. But let's move on, because I want to get to a few more questions, and I'm going to try, I think, to do a little bit of the Q&A if we have time. Let's take it to the U.S. I'm going to skip around a little. Anna, you argued on Tucker Carlson elsewhere that you believed that the Epstein files would affect American politics, if not the Trump administration, and also have argued that Americans care, that they are outraged, and you talked a little bit about that in your opening. I've heard some say that they believe that the Epstein files have been politicized to the point, like, if you are on the left or you're a Democrat, you are going to care about the Epstein files. You want to talk about them. You want to see them absolutely investigated, and let the chips fall where they may. If you're on the right, this is a hoax. This is a distraction. And we talked a little bit before coming on about this sort of divide, between the left and the right. Do you believe, A, that this is a partisan issue?
No,
And
no,
B,
not at all.
Okay. And B, do you think that it's deliberately being made a partisan issue so as that, people don't get together and start demanding answers together?
I'm actually curious what you all think, because nothing makes me want to rip my hair out more than hearing any Democratic member of Congress just hyper focus on the Trump angle to this story. Because, listen, whether or not there's evidence that Trump engaged in criminal activity, that should be disclosed. Obviously, I care about that. But I also care about the fact that I do see some politicians wanting to turn this into a partisan political issue for their own aspirations, their own purposes. And I'm not interested in that, because this story goes, like we've said, much deeper than, oh, Democrats bad or Republicans bad. I got news for you. They're both bad in different ways. And as it's related to the Epstein files, there are people who have been implicated in both sides of the political aisle. This, to me, is not a partisan issue. And anyone who is making it a partisan issue is suspect. Okay, very, very suspect. Or just doesn't really understand the gravity of the situation, hasn't read deeply into it, and doesn't understand that this goes beyond, pedophilia and sex trafficking. But for me, what has been a little bit of a white pill, if you will, is seeing people who were hardcore supporters of President Donald Trump. Owen Schroyer is a great example. I think Owen Schroyer was at the Capitol on January 6th. But after it was very clear that Trump was covering up the Epstein files, he started being critical of Trump. He used to work with Alex Jones, no longer working with Alex Jones. He's doing his own thing. I'm just using him as one example. He cares about this issue deeply, as much as I do. And I'm obviously not on the right. And so that gives me a little bit of hope, because if you just take a step back and reject the partisan framing that we get from our media and from our politicians and look at things in a very sober way, you'll see that most Americans who are paying attention to this story care deeply about it. They care about the deep state. They care about the fact that increasingly it appears that we do not live in a sovereign country where the voice of the people matter. This is not a government by the people for the people, especially if you have these shadowy figures behind the scenes, pulling strings and making deals that most people have no idea about. And so people want to know that they live in a free society, an open society, an actual democratic society. And right now, I think the individuals, the ordinary people in our country, at least, see that everything we were sold has been a lie. And we do need to, I don't know if it's even possible, but I think this is what we should be working toward. We need to purge these people from our government immediately. And we need to figure out how to do that. That's where my head is at right now. Whatever this deep state is, it needs to be dismantled. And that's a provocative thing to say, but it's important to keep in mind, we do not live in a sovereign country when you have shadowy figures making decisions that do not benefit us, but benefit other powerful players on the international scene.
I absolutely agree. And I guess my next question would be, and I think you were all talking about this before I got on in the green room, but how much out there has yet to be released? And does it focus on government, US government players? And that's why those files aren't being released yet. Can we get some measure as to what is still out there? And will Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna be successful and pushing this mandate, this law that says they all have to be released? Murtaza?
Yeah, so we know from the DOJ files, there are at least 3 million files which have not been released. And the government has said that they actually described the first disclosure, the one that took place recently, as kind of the last disclosure from the Epstein file. They said that the files that are remaining contain private data. There's other reasons we can't release them and so forth. But I think that that's a really unacceptable answer, because we've already seen so much. First of all, you can do redactions even of private information. That's not really insurmountable barrier at all. We've already seen this so much that they've attempted to not release at all. They've tried to pretend the entire thing was not susceptible to public oversight and scrutiny. So I think that that tranche is other information from his estate could be profoundly even more documentation and so forth. But I'm really focused on the remaining 3 million of the DOJ documents, because that's something that their resistance to releasing it, despite the fact it's legally mandated, is more telling in some ways.
Yeah.
Given how bad what they already put out is, you can only imagine what's in there. We think we need to see it. And if it is bad, we need to sort through it and to make sense of it and so forth, and have kind of a reckoning, as Anna mentioned, and we have the right to do that. Citizens of the United States, that's something that's that's inherent, that we should have the ability to do. So I think that we should continue pushing. And I think that the partnership between Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie is kind of inspiring about this, because I think that the entire paradigm of left and right is completely collapsing, in the sense that I think what we need is a new majority of people who are against corruption, who are against endless wars, who are against genocide, who are against sex trafficking, all these forms of corruption that have become endemic among our current elites. It all needs to go. And I think that regardless of your political leanings or your differences about different subjects, I think that the vast majority of people in America would agree on all those things. And the polls show that actually they're against these sort of policies and these approaches of people currently in power. So I think the Epstein issue has become extremely important as a symbolic tool, actually, to crystallize what we're against and who is on the side of, I guess, decency and law and order and so forth, and democracy, really. And I'll say one last thing. This I've talked to some people about this, and I know people from very different walks of life. Some of them are skeptical of the reporting. They say, well, what's the big deal? He was a rich guy, and obviously rich people are very powerful. And he was a billionaire, so of course a billionaire would have a political role and so forth. And I don't think everyone really agrees with that, but it's an interesting argument to engage with, because I think that that's the whole kind of problem with the current political system we have in the United States. Because if you were in, let's say, a country where the state is deemed superior, or at least has a balance of forces with people who have a lot of money, then you wouldn't be able to have someone who was like an Epstein coming, bossing around public officials who were answerable to and so forth. I think the problem with kind of capitalism that's developed, not the free market, not private property, and stuff like that, but just the idea that if someone is so rich and has so much capital, then their views and their political role will outweigh that of the general public, outweigh that of democratic institutions. That's something which is injurious to American society in a very deep way. And I think that's a question that we can all maybe coalesce around, that someone's degree of degree of wealth and their access to capital should not exactly correlate with their political influence. Because if that's true, then people like Epstein are going to continue tyrannizing us pretty much indefinitely. We need to find a way of finding these people, breaking up these pools of capital, and returning political power to the American public to stop these abuses.
Well said.
Harry, did you want to add something to that? And well, before you do, I want to ask you a quick question, because we're running out of time. Some of the folks in the Q&A are talking about the arrests in the UK, the resignations, the charges in other European countries against officials who are connected in some way to Epstein, even showing up in the emails. We haven't seen that kind of reckoning here in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe in the context of, we don't have all the files, so we don't know how many of our elected officials or former government leaders have been connected. So we still don't know the extent. And maybe that's why we don't have the same kind of outrage here that you're seeing in other parts of Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't hold my breath for anyone to get in trouble here, only because that's not what we do in this country. Like, for
That's
instance,
too
when
bad.
when Obama came into office in 2008, he was elected on the promise of prosecuting the torturers and
Yep.
the criminals in the financial industry. And he said, we're going to look forward and not backward. So the precedent is there for us to do exactly that in this case. And I imagine that's what we'll do. No one or very few people will be prosecuted. There's obviously some people like Larry Summers and Kathy Rumler who are having professional consequences, but I don't anticipate anything more than that. I do want to add to what Murtaza just said, because I agree with everything. There's one more thing that has not been released, which actually independent journalist Daniel Boguslaw has drawn attention to, which is that the CIA has documents on Epstein. Their National Resource Division, or NR, made NR reports on Epstein, just given the destinations that he was frequently flying to. And so those exist, and none of that has been released at all. So maybe the DOJ has them in the files that they still, need to release, but the public doesn't have them. And I guess this goes back to why we should all care about this, because as Anna was talking about, this is a shadow government. I mean, this is a deep state that knows really everything about us, increasingly so, with all their spying tools and their Palantir systems that they now have to interpret all the data that we just give them. We know very little about them at the same time, the people who control us and control the US government. And so this is just a tiny window that we have, that the heavily redacted Epstein files, the limited ones that have been released. It's a window into that world. And so anyone who's trying to conceal that from you to basically protect the US deep state, I mean, that's your enemy right there.
Agreed.
Agreed. Well said. And I think that's a good point on which to end. And I really, really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to all your work on this, and I will do my best to platform it in any way that I can. Before I let the audience go, I just wanted to give you a preview of another webinar that we have planned, the true cost of a $1.5 trillion Pentagon budget, on March 5th at noon. We have our great Ben Freeman, co-author of The $1 Trillion War Machine. We'll be talking with Justin Logan from Cato, Heidi Peltier from Brown University, and Steve Koziak, who is a Quincy Institute non-resident fellow. Please go on the quincyinst.org website to sign up for that. That's March 5th. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you to my panelists today.
Thank you so much.